Meu choro não é nada além de carnaval. É lágrima de samba na ponta dos pés. A multidão avança como um vendaval. Me joga na avenida que não sei qual é. Pirata e super-homem cantam o calor. Um peixe amarelo beija minha mão. As asas de um urso soltas pelo chão. Na chuva de confetes deixo a minha dor. Na avenida deixei lá a pele preta e a minha voz. Na avenida deixei lá a minha fala, a minha opinião. A minha casa, a minha solidão. Cheguei do alto do terceiro andar. Quebrei a cara e me livrei do resto dessa vida. Na avenida dura até o fim, mulher, eu sou, eu vou até o fim, cantar, mulher do fim. Eu vou até o fim, cantar, cantar. Eu quero cantar até o fim, me deixem cantar até o fim, até o fim eu vou cantar até o fim. Eu sou mulher do fim do mundo, eu vou cantar, me deixem cantar até o fim. La 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 la, até o fim eu vou cantar. Eu quero cantar, eu quero cantar, eu vou cantar até o fim. La 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 la. Eu vou cantar, me deixem cantar até o fim, me deixem cantar até o fim, me deixem cantar, me deixem cantar até o fim.
Sim, lindo. Welcome everyone. Boa tarde a todos, todas e todes. It's a pleasure to have you here with us again. Very exciting to have this panel one more time, to have you with us. Just a moment, I can hear Raquel on the main thing. So, I'm going to speak first in English about interpretation, then in Spanish, and then in Portuguese. So welcome again. It's really a pleasure to have you here with us. Please, if you're on your computer, check the option interpretation at the bottom of your screen. It's in the form of a globe, and select English. Then you hear only the interpretation. If you are on your cell phone, please check the option More, and then click on the 3 dots at the bottom, and then select Interpretation Service. You can mute the original audio and select English, and then Done. Now in Portuguese. Devidos a todos uma vez mais, é um grande prazer ter todo mundo aqui. Se você está no seu computador, verifique a opção de interpretação na parte inferior da tela, no formato de um globo. Você clica em interpretação, português, e depois você clica em pronto ou done, se tiver em inglês as suas referências de computação. Se você estiver no seu celular, você seleciona a opção mais, tem 3 pontos na parte de baixo do celular, clica em português, depois clica em pronto. E agora em espanhol, se está em sua computadora, verifique a interpretação em la opción inferior de la pantalla, donde está en formato de un globo, y seleccione español. Entonces, solo va a escuchar la interpretación. Selecciona un botón que está en forma de globo. Si está usando su teléfono, seleccione la opción más, haga un clic en los 3 puntos en la parte inferior, seleccione español y listo. One more time, thank you so much, everyone. And I pass to Janvieve.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Ana. Thank you very much. Obrigado a todo el mundo. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides. And I will speak in English just to keep it smoother. If you are watching us via the live stream on Facebook, unfortunately, there will not be any interpretation available to you, but it's not too late to join us on the via the Zoom link. So I first want to always thank the ancestors for bringing us all together and to really honor the times that we are living in, because we are living in some hard times, both especially Black people globally are being directly impacted at a disproportionate rate due to the pandemic and due to the ongoing systemic and structural racism and violence that plagues us in these times. So I really want to honor people that are transitioning constantly and really hold them in this space and to welcome everybody again. I also want to thank the interpreters. Without the interpreters, this work would not be possible. Sometimes interpreters get kind of shadowed over, but not at Afro Resistance because they're an integral, and I say an integral part of the work that we do. So thank you to Priscila Abreu, to Raquel de Sousa, and to Lady Vidal for joining us today. The format today is meant to connect the communities with international human rights mechanisms. And we want to open up the borders. We want to open up the fronteras. If you have questions or comments, please make sure that you use the Q&A function that is at the bottom. That way all the panelists can get it and we can also translate it for them to receive it. If it's in the chat sometimes goes by really, really fast and we will not be monitoring the chat at that level. But if you have comments and you want to share love or insight without it being addressed, then definitely put that on the chat. And if you could translate yourself, that would be even better, but we understand if you cannot. If you are watching us online, please send us comments and questions using the Afro Resistance hashtag and Entre Fronteras and Beyond Borders, and we'll be pasting that in a few seconds over there and over here too, and we will definitely integrate those questions throughout our panel today. Check our YouTube channels where you can find all our previous panels, because this is a series of sessions that we have done since March, and this is our last block for the year. So you are actually watching our closing for the COVID as a global human rights issue talking series. And they're also called Entre Fronteras, Between Borders. So I will open up with presenting our amazing speakers today. And I'm so honored to have everybody here, right? Dr. Gay McDougall is a former vice chair of the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. She was the first United Nations independent expert on minority issues, and for 14 years, she was the executive director of Global Rights, which worked with human rights advocates in 10 countries around the world to develop their strategies for justice. Prior to that, she played a special role in securing the release of thousands of political prisoners in South Africa and Namibia. She was then appointed to the Electoral Commission that in 1994 ran the first democratic elections in South Africa that ended apartheid and installed Nelson Mandela as president. Dr. McDougall is a distinguished scholar in residence at Leitner Center for International Law and Justice, Fordham University School of Law. She earned a JD, and I always get confused with the acronyms, at Yale Law, and an LLM in Public International Law at the London Schools of Economic and Politics, and a BA and a Bachelor of Arts in Social Science at Bennington College. She was honorary Doctor of Law degrees. She has honorary Doctors of Law degrees from 9 universities, including University to Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I'm just going to read through all the bios, and then we will also paste them on the side as each speaker speaks, and we'll paste them in on the chat, and we'll paste them in the different languages. Jodi-Ann Quarrie holds an LLB from the University of the West Indies, an LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Notre Dame, and a legal education certificate from Norman Manley Law School. She was a Romulo Gallegos Fellow at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and obtained an advanced certificate in Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights from American University Washington College of Law. She was named as one of the United Nations Fellows for People of African Descent and completed her fellowship at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. Jodi-Ann has worked to have language rights included in the Jamaican Constitution and assisted in the release of persons detained in Jamaica for over 30 years without conviction. Jodi-Ann is a member of the Barbados and Jamaica bars and worked at UWI's Center for Reparation Research on the biggest human rights cases in the modern Caribbean, reparations for transatlantic slavery. We have Adwoa, Adwoa Kufuor-Owusu has an extensive human rights experience, not only on gender and women's rights, but also on a broader angle of human rights and peace and security, including in the context of the United Nations hybrid missions. Prior to joining the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Addis Ababa, Adwoa served as an advisor on human rights of women, focusing specifically on violence against women. Adwoa previously worked as a special assistant, joint special representative to Darfur, Professor Ibrahim Gambari, and as a child protection advisor and analyst and researcher at the African Union and the groundbreaking NGO Sudan Organization Against Torture. She has also worked in Nigeria to support research, policy work, partnerships, and advocacy in integrating human rights within the work of the UN country team. And then finally, we have Janice Ferreira Preta, who is a multi-artist and communicator. She is the eldest of 8 siblings. As a teenager, she came from Bahia to Sao Paulo, and from an early age, she worked to help support her family income. Preta graduated in advertising and consolidated her career in cultural production. She is also the author and interpreter of The Single Mina Carne. Her mission is to transform the world for cultural economic development for small groups with the promotion of peace and social justice. As she points out, at Ocupação 9 de Julio, Preta organizes cultural and social economic educational events, from research labs, laboratory workshops, shows, and health and leisure activities. So I would like to welcome our distinguished panel today, and I would like to give the word to Dr. Gay McDougall. Thank you and welcome.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this series of panel discussions. And I want to congratulate those who have organized this whole series of events. It is both imaginative in its design and spot on in terms of connecting people to the human rights mechanisms in Geneva that are often very difficult for people to imagine what in the world goes on in Geneva. But so I want to give some love to all those who participated in organizing this. And I want to talk for just a few minutes about the right to housing, because this is in many ways the foundation of the many rights that we must enjoy. It is certainly featured in the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It is prominent in the International Convention on the elimination of discrimination against women, on the rights of children, as well as in the two covenants on political and civil rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights. But it's, you know, it's widely understood as being about the right to live somewhere with security and with dignity and in peace. And so it is very essential, as I've said, but it also includes the right to live under those circumstances, as they say, an adequate, you know, housing means you got to have services. You have got to be somewhere that is affordable, that is accessible, and that has a sort of cultural adequacy. In the United States and in CERD, we talk a lot about segregation of housing. Segregated housing and housing discrimination has been shown, at least in the United States, to be very key in securing the right to adequate quality education. And I certainly know, as an African-American who grew up at the time of apartheid, if you will, in the southern states of the United States, that we were forced to live in very limited spaces. Residential housing was mandated by law. You generally had no adequate services. You know, the streets in town would be paved all the way up to the point where the area designated housing of African Americans. And you get no street paved. There you get no street lights. There you get no places to shop for food. There you get no banking, no way to get a loan unless it's at extremely high rates. And there you will get terrible schools. I went to a school that was physically, you know, the structure was substandard. There are over 1,000 kids jammed into this one place, maybe more. There was no equipment. There were no science labs. We had wonderful, caring teachers, but that was because all those people who wanted to be teachers in the African American community only could teach in that school. And so they were burdened with overcoming all of those other obstacles put in the way of equality. But in this era of COVID, we're facing something else. And that is that the eviction rates are astronomical. People who have worked all their lives, they've never been out of work, they've been hard workers, etc. find that they have no jobs because COVID has forced closures of everything except for the most essential services. And what they find is that, first of all, they quickly run out of food, but also the landlord is threatening to put them out. And while there has been some relief given in the laws in various cities and states that allow people to, be forgiven for not paying rent for a certain period of time, that period of time is running out. And we're facing massive evictions, people living on the streets all over. Now, the thing that I think is very important to the discussions here, and certainly important to us who were trying to see that the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was being observed, is that when you intersect those circumstances with the fact that COVID has had a greatly disproportionate impact on people of color, or Black and brown people in this country, because of systemic racism and the existence of systemic racism for so long. Then you've got a situation where those who are going to be put out on the street first are Black and brown people. And it's going to be greatly disproportionate to our population numbers. That's going to be tragic. It's going to be incredible in so many ways that I could describe, but it's also going to be a violation of the rights, the human rights of those being turned out into the streets. So I will stop there, and I would love to hear the others on the panel, and I also welcome any questions that are directed toward me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gay. We are going to give the word now to Jodi-Ann.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for bringing us all together. It's an important thing for us to have these sorts of, as you said, across-border conversations, between border conversations, because while there are many similarities, there are also differences. And the similarities allow us to work together, but understanding our own particular circumstances in our countries is critical for us to come up with a global approach to dealing with this issue. The topic is housing rights as essential to racial and gender justice. And for me, that has been a critical discussion that's been going on right now. As Dr. McDougall has indicated, COVID-19 has highlighted everything. It's highlighted all the dysfunctions that we've been speaking of before, but they've been exacerbated now during this time. So when we talk about the right to housing, that's for me very important to first explain, because many people believe that the right to housing means that your country must provide you with a house, and a nice one too. And that's not accurate. The right to housing is not about the right to be provided with a home Although there is a lovely constitutional court decision in South Africa that says in dire circumstances where there's extreme need, there is a responsibility on the state to provide a home. I make that distinction because that's a discussion going on in my own country of Jamaica now, this need to provide a home. But during the time of COVID-19, we've also had intense rains here. Though we have not been impacted by hurricanes this hurricane season, we pray we are not. The season ends at the end of November. The significant rains have meant landslides and serious dislocations for many people. And so the right to housing then chips in, because if persons can no longer live in their homes or their homes are unsafe, what responsibility does the state have to make sure that these individuals are in fact housed? And if the state has a responsibility, do they have any extra responsibilities to make sure that it's non-discriminatory? That is, it isn't discriminating against people on the basis of their race, and it isn't discriminating against people on the basis of their gender. And these are two very important groups for us to consider, because these are groups that traditionally have had more vulnerable housing situations. For a discussion about the right to adequate housing, though you're hearing a discussion about the right to housing, it has been reframed as the right to adequate housing, because the committee for the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights that oversees the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has specifically said in its general comments that the right to adequate housing isn't just four walls and a roof. For many people, that's very difficult for them to appreciate, that it is not just that people need to have somewhere to stay, but it needs to be an adequate place to stay. And this conversation becomes incredibly important when there have been long-term dispossessions of individuals and they haven't been able to stay where they need to in a safe manner. But COVID-19 has really highlighted that for the very first time, we didn't know how many people were homeless and without housing. And even the definition of homelessness is not agreed all across the world. So various governments will cherry pick what they want to consider to be homeless or not. We've never considered that even where people did have homes, they were sharing homes with so many people that they could not all afford to stay home during lockdowns. For the very first time in Jamaica, for example, individuals were becoming aware that in one-bedroom homes, there were 10 or 12 or 15 people living in there on a single bed. And what they had to do was rotate hours. So persons who went to work in the day would allow for others who stayed home to sleep. When all those people were forced to stay home, this created chaos. And many persons felt that there was no awareness in government policy that recognized that the right to adequate housing also meant that the right for individuals to stay in a space that accommodated them. And then finally, in this conversation for me, as I characterize this right to adequate housing conversation and how it connects with gender and race, is that there are multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. What happens if you're a woman who's Black? What happens if you are a Black man with disabilities? What happens if you have multiple things that affect your right to housing, and therefore the kind of housing you can have access to, or even your ability to access housing at all? It is an important conversation that Entre Fronteras has put before us, one that says the right to housing has a justice component. And some particular groups need that justice more urgently than ever. So I'm glad to be with you today to engage in this conversation. And I look forward to having this feedback, not only from my fellow panelists, but from you as we engage in this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that information and to connecting, right? We're weaving together what Dr. Gay just mentioned. Thank you so much, Jodi-Ann, for doing that for us. And as we continue the conversation, let's keep on layering. I'm going to invite Adwoa to join us.
Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. Me too, I'm very honored to be among such distinguished panelists. I'm not going to repeat what many of us know, that international human rights law recognizes everyone's right to adequate standard of living, which a component of that, of course, is adequate housing. This goes as far back as the UDHR, that's the Universal Declaration of 1948, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and many other international human rights treaties have recognized, or at least referred to, the right to adequate housing, or some of it, in particular when we talk about protection of one's home and privacy. And as we are hearing from our previous speakers, despite the central place of this right, over 1 billion people globally are not adequately housed. Millions around the world live in health and life-threatening conditions, overcrowded slums, informal settlements, and in other conditions that do not uphold the dignity of humans. We also know there are many who are forcibly evicted or threatened with forced eviction from their human rights every year. Adequate housing is not just about having 4 walls. And I think Dr. McDougall has referred to many of those things, that it needs to be present, and therefore I will not go into detail. She spoke about availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure, affordability, accessibility, location, security of tenure. All these things have to be there if you're to say we have adequate, or the state is supposed to say they have provided adequate housing. And because of this very critical importance of having housing, the Human Rights Council has a mandate holder, a special rapporteur on the right to housing. And over the years, and this mandate has been in place since 2000. So this is 20 years later, we are still talking about this issue. And over the years, the mandate holder have all clarified what it means for states and what does it mean when we talk about adequate housing. And the current mandate holder, who's from India, has identified some of the very serious issues of concern when it comes to ethnic minorities. I'm going to make this reference to ethnic minorities because I'll be speaking from the perspective of the UN, certainly, but also as somebody, as a migrant who lives in the UK, and I've lived here for most of my life. The mandate holder has talked about the importance of tackling the disproportionate numbers of ethnic minority groups who live in substandard, overcrowded, and inappropriate accommodation, not just in England, but in the global north, where the majority of the millions I mentioned are from marginalized groups, likely to be from minority groups, and that includes, of course, sexual minorities as well. These countries, these member states have been asked to really focus on the reasons why ethnic minorities are more likely to live in such poor conditions and overcrowded housing, intergenerational housing, and to adopt strategies. This is an obligation. They are supposed to, by virtue of signing the CESC, which is the covenant, the 1960s Covenant on Civil, on Economic, Social, on economic, cultural, and social rights, and to also look at not only the state's role, so when we talk about state housing, but also private landlords, and how the private landlords conduct their rights to rent checks, which, and in their practices, we know in many countries is applied unfairly to minorities, resulting in race discrimination against prospective tenants. The countries have been called on to also use the regulatory bodies to make sure they do more frequent mystery shopping exercises to check where private landlords and rental agencies are discriminating on the grounds of race, or when letting their properties and they use evidence obtained as a basis for exercising other powers to other discriminatory practices. We've already heard from previous speakers about the impacts of COVID-19 on the right to housing. I'm going to just echo what has been said and re-emphasize that the impacts we've seen on the right to housing reflects pre-existing social, legal, and political discrimination along racial lines, along gender lines, and along many other fault lines. And that we know it's not only housing, but marginalized groups are disproportionately experiencing what is largely preventable suffering and mortality. We have seen a spike in evictions across the globe, not just in the global north. We've seen a spike in hunger, homelessness, and all of this. And we've seen also expiration of eviction bans and other temporary measures to protect tenants. All this, of course, have disproportionately impacted minorities, including especially women. In many countries as well, forced evictions have continued despite COVID, and if not even accelerated. We have human rights and business. We have human rights defenders working in the business sector, where a mining industry, where many governments are using the pretext of COVID and with their attention drawn elsewhere to move people from their homes, claiming on the grounds of overcrowding. Now, I've already mentioned that governments have an obligation to provide access to permanent housing as well. So homelessness and that is the key to response and recovery of COVID measures to the pandemic is housing, and adequate housing and safe housing. In the global north, I mentioned, and just to quickly end on the experience of the UK, where Black and minority ethnic communities we've seen with the COVID are really bearing the brunt of years of homelessness, and where race continues to be a defining characteristic in the nation's housing system. There are statistics, and they are open out there and anybody can have it, that shows that 36% of people accepted as homeless by local authorities in England during 2016 to 2018 were from Black and ethnic minority background, close to 3 times their representation in the population. And of the official homeless applications, 17% were African Caribbean origin, although they're only 4% of the population. This disproportionate level of housing it became very obvious for many of you who would have heard of the Grenfell Tower fire, where we saw that the majority of the residents from the tower were from Black and minority background. And the treatment after the fire also reveals this racism and this discrimination that I'm talking about. I won't go into detail, perhaps in the question and answer, we can say more. I will end, at least in the UK, that Black and minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely than white ones to experience what we call housing stress. Housing stress, talking about overcrowding, poorer quality of housing, fuel poverty, so you cannot go to work, and are mostly concentrated in the most deprived areas. You're more likely to wait for housing. You're more likely to be offered poor quality homes when they are offered, and you're more likely to be offered flats than houses. In fact, we've seen some housing officers who encourage Black and minority groups to move away from white neighborhoods, who offer them based on their own judgment of social class, as well as the racial backgrounds. Of course, among all this, institutional racism plays a role in reinforcing these racial discrimination and disadvantages in housing. Despite this, we have to keep talking about this, and I will conclude with saying that this is a reality of millions living in the global north, and not just in England. And the issue of adequate housing and access to housing is very much one of the critical rights that allows people to be able to exercise many other human rights, including right to health, right to work, and in the end, right to life. I'll conclude here. Thank you. And again, thank you for inviting OECHR to be part of this panel. It's been an honor.
Thank you very much, Adwoa, for that. And we've heard from 3 different countries right now, right? And centering the conversation as a global issue. And one of the things that is standing out to me as I'm listening is while we're focusing on housing and the impacts on gender and race, we're also, Afro-resistance engages in work around Black girls and women, right? So when we think about the rights of the child, which the U.S. is not a signatory of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, when we think about Black girls, right, and the impact that this is having on Black children in general, and of children of color in general, housing as a right for these children is being denied. That's just one of the aspects of it, right? And when we think about how different states that do not implement a human rights lens to the work, how different states react and relate to housing of children or lack of housing, one of the immediate responses is separation of family, separation of children from their parents, instead of looking critically at the issue around housing as that right that is being violated, that also links to economic justice, that also links to access to education, that also links to access to health and well-being and the different human rights that everybody is entitled to. So as we're hearing, and now we're going to invite Preta to be to join us in the conversation as well. As we're listening, let's start also thinking, what are the different rights that housing centers that are also being violated? And how could the different mechanisms, if state and if civil society were really engaged in human rights work? And one of the comments I read, a people-centered human rights approach. What if civil society, and that means all of us here, were really empowered and took the power to demand our rights, to shape what those rights look like? What would this be? What would it look like? Preta, I would like to invite you to continue our dialogue. Thank you.
Muito boa tarde. Aqui no Brasil ainda é tarde, né? Estou muito feliz e muito honrada de estar com tantas irmãs, unindo tantas forças assim, em todos os lugares do mundo. Isso me dá a sensação de não estar sozinha na luta. E eu queria agradecer a todas vocês por estarem aí na linha de frente para salvar nossos irmãos, para nos salvarmos, porque só depende de nós, né? A gente pode fazer juntos. E muito obrigada de verdade. Vocês são verdadeiras heroínas em todos os lugares do mundo. A gente tem nossas heroínas, nossos heróis continuam vivos. Falar sobre a questão de moradia aqui no Brasil é muito fácil, porque a negação dos direitos constitucionais para a população preta desse país se deu desde a época da falsa libertação dos escravizados, quando simplesmente libertaram os povos que foram tirados de suas terras, tirados de seus lares, sem dar-lhes o direito de ter um lugar para morar, de ter uma terra para plantar e deixar essas pessoas à míngua, sem nada. Então, o direito constitucional à moradia ele é negado desde a época da falsa libertação da escravidão. A escravidão ainda existe no Brasil, que foi o último país a abolir a escravidão, né? Então, a gente ainda persiste com essa escravidão quando se há falta de moradia. Eu faço parte do MSTC, Movimento Sem Teto do Centro. Eu trabalho com moradia para trabalhadores e trabalhadoras de baixa renda. E quando a gente fala da questão da moradia, é um assunto muito amplo, porque não é só a casa, não é só o morar. Tem educação, o lazer, a cultura, a comida. Como é que essas pessoas vão sobreviver? Então, o meu movimento trabalha, faz toda essa articulação para que todas essas garantias de direitos sejam conquistadas, principalmente o direito da criança e do adolescente, que a gente vê que não existe, que é um direito inexistente. Então, eu trabalho através da arte, através de outros parceiros, para que esses direitos sejam garantidos. Então, a população civil, né, a população que nos garante que tem esse direito, mas que essas pessoas pretas, e principalmente essas crianças e adolescentes, não têm. Então, a gente faz diversas parcerias com a população civil, com professores, com dançarinos, com músicos, com intérpretes, com pessoas que falam outras linguagens, diversas áreas da cultura, dentro das ocupações, para que essas crianças, esses adolescentes, tenham esses direitos garantidos, porque tudo começa na base. Tudo começa pela adolescência, tudo começa pela criança. Então, a gente garante, antes de mais nada, antes de um teto, os direitos constitucionais, todos. Eu, recentemente, fui presa aqui no Brasil, fui considerada um perigo para a sociedade pelos homens brancos, pelos senhores feudais, porque eu luto pelo direito constitucional à moradia. Então, eu fui considerada uma terrorista. Por quê? Conseguimos, no centro de São Paulo, mostrar que é possível, sim, se fazer políticas públicas voltadas ao trabalhador de baixa renda, ocupando prédios vazios, ociosos, sem função social da propriedade, tirando essas pessoas das ruas. Então, a gente conquistou o direito à moradia no centro de São Paulo, em um hotel velho, que estava abandonado há mais de 20 anos, o antigo hotel Cambridge, e esse hotel hoje está em reforma e vai ser moradia definitiva para 121 famílias. Então, eu e minha mãe, Carmen Silva, estamos conquistando o direito à moradia e mostrando ao poder público que sim, que é possível se fazer política pública voltada para trabalhadores de baixa renda, e principalmente para pessoas pretas, que sempre tiveram esses direitos constitucionais negados, e principal o direito à moradia, nas regiões centrais. Porque esse trabalhador de baixa renda, ele acabava perdendo a maior parte da sua vida dentro do transporte público, indo para o trabalho que é no centro, na região central, onde tem os melhores empregos, as melhores escolas, os melhores hospitais, e voltando para suas casas, que eram em locais longes, afastados. Então, eles não viam as crianças crescerem, essas famílias, o pai e a mãe. Acabavam-se que criavam um outro mundo, uma outra comunidade, no bairro afastado em que eles viviam. Então, o MSTC, o Movimento Sem Teto do Centro, mostrou e continua mostrando, né? Mesmo depois dessa prisão injusta que eu sofri, mesmo depois da minha mãe ser perseguida, ficou foragida, que a gente continua na luta, mas é para a garantia desses direitos constitucionais. Nós, pessoas pretas, nos tornamos um perigo para a sociedade, mas para a sociedade dos senhores feudais, para a sociedade dos homens brancos, quando mostramos que eles é que são os criminosos, quem está no poder e tem que garantir esses direitos constitucionais para pessoas pretas e não garante, são criminosos. Então, eles invertem a lógica, criminalizam os movimentos de moradia, os movimentos sociais aqui no Brasil, prendem essas lideranças para enfraquecer o trabalhador de baixa renda. Só que aqui em São Paulo, as pessoas morrem de frio nas ruas e existem mais prédios abandonados do que pessoas precisando de moradia. Então, é possível, sim, tirar todas essas pessoas da rua, mas a gente precisa capacitar essas pessoas, a gente precisa criar oportunidade para essas pessoas, oportunidade de emprego, para que essas pessoas paguem por suas moradias, mas que paguem um preço que caiba no seu bolso. Porque não adianta você colocar um trabalhador de baixa renda para morar numa região onde o aluguel é altíssimo e o emprego dele, o salário mínimo aqui no Brasil, que não cabe, né, para pagar esse aluguel. Então, a gente luta por moradia básica, mas é uma moradia em que as pessoas se sintam seres humanos. A gente não quer que essas pessoas se sintam, que morem em barracos, que morem em casas de pau a pique. A gente quer que essas pessoas sejam cidadãos, mas que tenham seus direitos constitucionais garantidos, assim como outro qualquer. Por que existem tantos prédios abandonados? Para quê? Porque a especulação imobiliária que está dominando o mundo inteiro estão jogando trabalhadores nas ruas. Tudo isso para que grandes empresários, para que grandes empreiteiros tenham aí, de novo, né, a posse de grandes prédios a custos baratos, enquanto essas pessoas pobres estão nas ruas. A gente tem que começar a explicar que ninguém quer morar de graça, que as pessoas trabalham, querem morar, mas querem pagar um preço que elas tenham condições de pagar, porque senão elas vão parar nas ruas. Com a pandemia mundial, né, a gente viu o aumento da população de rua e a especulação imobiliária ainda continua colocando essas pessoas nas ruas, porque eu considero essa pandemia um apartheid. Por que eu considero um apartheid? Quem enche os ônibus, quem enche os meios de transportes para ir trabalhar ainda são as pessoas pretas. Ainda é essa população que enche os meios de transportes, que estão propícias a pegar o Covid-19, porque elas não têm a garantia de seus direitos constitucionais. Então, elas têm que sair em meio a uma pandemia para ir trabalhar, para serem realmente escravizadas, continuarem sendo escravizadas. Então, a nossa luta é para que nossos irmãos não sejam mais escravizados. é para que nossos irmãos entendam que moradia é um direito constitucional e que esse direito tem que ser prevalecido. Muito obrigada a todas vocês.
Obrigada, Preta, Ferreira. Thank you very much for that. And you know, so there is a commonality and there is a thread in every single one of our panelists, and it's the vulnerability that Black people and that Black women have. You know, Preta spoke about family separation as something intentionally that is being done and forged through housing, through the housing lens, and how lack of housing also means displacement. Lack of housing means having to decide to move from an ancestral land or a land where you have lived and grown up and seen your family and your children flourish. So let's continue the dialogue. Before we have a question from one of our from the public, right, that we're going to play. But before that, I shared recently a link to the Black Women and Girls Fund. And it's really important for people that are viewing us to understand that when we talk about migration, Black people are not usually included in those conversations. And if our stories and ourselves are not included in those conversations when it comes to policy, we're also not included when it comes to support. Afro-resistance has really been centering Black women and girls and being able to offer them financial and economic assistance, because most of the organizations, if they don't have Black staff or if they don't have Black leadership, they're really not paying attention to us. So we're not getting the support that we need to keep it moving forward. There's so many undocumented Black people, and disproportionately, we are the ones that are being deported at higher rates, as Adwoa shared earlier on as well. So please consider supporting and applying. If you or any Black woman from the United States or from the region needs support, we have an application form. We'll put it in the chat later. Now we are going to show one of the questions that we got from our community. And then we'll come back to Dr. Gay. And thank you, Marie, for all this work.
Greetings. My name is Halima Washington, and I'm here with y'all from the Bronx in New York City. And my question is, according to the Coalition for the Homeless, approximately 57% of heads of household in shelters are Black, and 32% are Hispanic or Latinx. And research has shown that the primary causes of homelessness, particularly among families, is a lack of affordable housing, being evicted, doubled up, severely overcrowded in housing, domestic violence, job loss, and hazardous housing conditions. Yet, the affordable housing that's currently available and or being built here in New York City has income requirements that far exceed what most people are being paid or even able to afford. Homeless people and families are instead criminalized instead of addressing the real issues, which is housing inequity and inequality. Can you please help me understand how this is allowed to continue to happen? Thanks.
Thank you so much to Halima Washington, a Bronx resident here in New York City. And Dr. Gay, I'm going to hand it over to you, that maybe you can guide us through, like, what could we respond to this? How could we make use of the UN mechanisms?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so much that I would say on the international level, on the regional level, and there's some cross-border or you know, solutions that I could talk about just quickly. On the international level, you know, I think any of you can invite the Special Rapporteur on Housing to visit your country, to travel around, to look at the circumstances, to talk to communities, to understand the realities of the lived experience, and then to write a useful, hopefully, report. If the rapporteur cannot, for some reason, come, there's another thing that the rapporteur can do, and that is to write to the government to say that they have heard that these are the circumstances that exist. You know, if it is correct, then you would be in violation of these rights and these commitments on your part. And if they're not true, tell me and let's have a dialogue about it.
Exactly.
And then that eventually is made public. So that's one thing. Secondly, I think that you can go to, let's talk about the treaty bodies. We all on the panels have talked about the various treaties, human rights treaties, the CEDAW, which looks at discrimination against women, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, all of them, along with the Committee of the International Convention Against Racial Discrimination, they all have, you know, provisions on the right to housing. And so when your country is up for review by the appropriate committee, you can, you know, appear or submit as an NGO to talk about your circumstances and make sure that that is a part of the record that the treaty body considers when deciding on whether or not that your government has abided by its obligations. Now, there are some countries like my own that have not joined all of these treaty regimes. And so if your government has, as the US has, signed and joined the Racism Committee, for example. The thing about the Racism Committee is that it actually addresses all rights. And in essence, it said, look, you know, maybe you didn't sign the Economic and Social Committee treaty that has extensive coverage on the right to housing. Doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. Because the Racism Committee covers it all. And while the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has this little provision that says, well, governments, you have this obligation, but you have that it's a progressive obligation. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can argue effectively that you don't have the resources right now to meet the demands, but show us that you're moving in that direction. Under the Racism Convention, there is no progression. If you're discriminated, you got to stop it today. and take effective measures today. So it's a very effective mechanism, and we're all here to talk about discrimination. One other thing about the Racism Convention and CERD, the treaty body that implements it. CERD has a very unique procedure called the Early Warning and Urgent Action procedure. So even if your country is not up for the regular periodic review every 2 or 4 years, but you have a complaint that can be considered to be about an urgent situation or an impending situation that would lead to a massive violation of the rights against discrimination. You could bring it to CERD immediately. And I think that this situation with COVID would be considered to meet those criteria. And the Racism Committee, CERD, will consider it immediately and make a pronouncement, reaching out to the government, take a decision, and make that public immediately. Yeah. Just quickly, I do think that we cannot forget the regional body that has jurisdiction throughout the Americas, throughout our whole, hemisphere. From time to time has tended to make some very progressive findings, even though at this moment, maybe it's not at its zenith in terms of that. But the Inter-American Commission, I think, is very much worth appealing to. There is a special rapporteur on people of African descent who is mandated by the commission. And she's from Jamaica, I believe.
Yes, she is.
Yes. Yes. So, she is somebody that you can appeal to for more immediate action. And you can always have before the commission hearings. And this is something that I would put before Afro-resistance, because it would be a unique and useful thing to have a hearing on the right to housing, looking at the entire hemisphere of African descendant people and the denial of the right to housing throughout our hemisphere. That is a direct derivative of the condition that we suffered under slavery, and the failure of governments to correct those circumstances post-slavery. I would also make this suggestion, listening to particularly Preta and her testimony. It is, I think, very important that, especially when you have I'm going to call it a multi-country, organization and dialogue like this, that we do work on sharing coping mechanisms. Yes. They're not solutions, but they're coping mechanisms. And, one of the things that communities have been trying out here in the US has been to set up well, I take your example to having taken over a building in the center of town, let's say, that was abandoned, and then to try different mechanisms to own it in common, a collective ownership, and press the city government to grant ownership. And then you figure out how to finance it in common, and take out a mortgage, which it gives you more legal security of tenure. Now, it might be very useful to have Preta and her group visit the US when that's possible and meet some of these communities that have been trying this out, and to talk to them about some of the ways that have worked and not worked, and things to think about if you want to try it in Brazil. So I think that's another thing that Afro-resistance can consider, doing, trading some possible solutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gay. And we have a question from Martha, right? In regards to specifically what you said around Preta and Brazil, the question is towards Preta, and I would like to include Adwoa in this question too, around Preta, if you could explain to us the constitutional right that is in the Constitution of Brazil in regards to housing and land and squatting, right? And what does that mean? And what does that mean in regards to advocacy? Because I think it's very specific. And if you know what the struggle or the fight was, and continues to uphold that constitutional right to take over, to squat, basically, to take over land. I don't know if Preta heard me. Yes.
Eu ouvi sim, sobre nossas ocupações. Quando nós ocupamos, a prioridade são as mulheres aqui no Brasil, porque as mulheres aqui são arrimos de família. Então a gente precisa pegar esses exemplos aqui do Brasil, aqui dos nossos movimentos, e realmente fazer um intercâmbio entre as lutas. Eu concordo plenamente com a doutora Gay, que quando ela diz que a gente precisa usar exemplos de objetivos que funcionam, de lutas que funcionam para levar para outros países. Eu concordo plenamente, e eu acho que a gente tem que começar a usar esses exemplos para ter essa tratativa com os governantes. Então, o governo daqui de São Paulo houve uma tratativa com o movimento de moradia há alguns anos atrás, quando ouviu a necessidade dos movimentos, e se existe movimento de moradia, é porque há a necessidade de moradia. Porque ninguém ocupa porque quer, ocupa porque há necessidade de morar. Então, a gente precisa reformular o conceito de moradia. Por que é interessante trabalhador de baixa renda morar nas capitais, nas grandes capitais, nos centros das cidades? Porque esses prédios vivem vazios, ociosos, abandonados, sem função social da propriedade, onde o proprietário também comete crime. Esses crimes de especulação imobiliária, de deixar o prédio vazio, enquanto as pessoas morrem de frio, os impostos não estão sendo pagos. Então, o trabalhador de baixa renda, ao ocupar, ele não encontra um prédio bonito, reformado. A gente tem que ter o trabalho também de reformar o que era luxo, o que era lixo, né? Para eles era um lixo e acabou se tornando luxo para o trabalhador de baixa renda que necessita da moradia. Então, é interessante a gente explicar para os nossos irmãos de outros países como se ocupar o que está vazio, como transformar o lixo em luxo para trabalhadores de baixa renda, como transformar esses prédios abandonados, ociosos, sem função social da propriedade, em moradia digna, para essas pessoas pretas. Então, o movimento ele tem toda essa articulação, o meu movimento, o MSTC, de se preocupar em tornar essas pessoas, em realmente reinseri-las em sociedade, né? Porque não adianta cobrar inserção social de quem nunca realmente foi inserido. Então, o MSTC, o Movimento Sem Teto do Centro, aqui em São Paulo, ele atua diretamente, explicando também para essas pessoas o que é os documentos, como tirar essas documentações, para que serve cada documento. E isso inclui também os refugiados, que o Brasil ele abre as portas, mas essas pessoas não têm onde morar. Então, o movimento de moradia ele acaba cumprindo essa função que é do governo, de trazer a moradia, de explicar sobre a questão de documentação e trazer de volta essa pessoa para ser um cidadão, que é o que ela merece, independente de sua cor. Então, o movimento ele tem essa preocupação em trazer de volta o cidadão, trazer o resgate do cidadão de bem.
Obrigada. Thank you so much, Preta. Adwoa, is there anything else that you would like to add? Is there an experience around squatting in UK for housing?
I think just to follow on with the previous speaker about bringing so what we've seen, at least with the human rights mechanisms, with the special rapporteur, is issues around slum dwelling, informal settlement, and the issue about rights to land. Who has that land? Who has the right, the paper, the title, which many people don't have titles. We know this. And does the possession then trumps title? And what we've seen is the special rapporteur on the right to housing in 2018 has issued a very seminal report on adopting, for member states, on adopting rights-based approaches to formalizing informal settlement and making sure that it doesn't trump this right of I have the title to the land, doesn't trump the right to adequate housing. We know these type of squatting and these informal dwellings is a result of discrimination, injustice, poverty. There are root causes why people are squatting and are living in informal setting. And this report is really also about the SDGs that many of you are familiar with, the Sustainable Development Goals, which has a goal 11, which is on about housing. And for that, it's an issue of states, member states. Every country has committed, whether they have signed, as Dr. McDougall said or not, the Sustainable Development Goals, similar to the MDGs, doesn't require ratification. All countries have signed up to ensure adequate housing by 2030. And one of them is having a rights-based approach of looking at how the systemic exclusion and the lack of access to whether it's work allows people to live in such conditions. Specifically in the UK, there was an interesting decision that was made in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, but forgive me if I get the date wrong, where it was about Scotters' rights. And there's the Human Rights Act in the UK based on the European Human Rights Act. And the case was, did the landlord have a right to forcefully evict squatters? And the court ruled that they do, that squatters having no home doesn't mean that other people can suffer for you not having a home, that the state should provide adequate compensation to the title owner. And that I cannot lose my title merely because I'm not currently in possession of it. And I think that's where we've heard the speakers talk about empty houses. And what we are seeing is there's a large campaign going on in England with the Guardian newspaper, especially about all these houses sitting empty, whether it's in London and it's owned by people who don't live here or spend very little time in them, and yet sitting there empty, and yet in winter people are sleeping on the street. And how can the state has an obligation to make sure if not these houses, that it provides adequate housing. So that I think it's two ways in the sense that there is about the root causes. Why do we have squatters in the first place? And unless we address it, having people occupy these houses are not addressing the root causes of why people need to live as squatters. I repeat again, it's systemic exclusion, it's racism, it's discrimination. And this is what we really need to be talking about, addressing these root causes and really banging our government's head over that we must address these things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adwoa. We have a question, and I'm so sorry we might not get to all the questions. I'm trying to put questions together that are very similar. We have a question from Yaya Coleman from in Belize. And their question is, what is the consequence of the United Nations holding states accountable for violations of these conventions, right? If the consequence is not real in time, and it has visible change action by the state in a timely fashion, then what is the incentive for civil society to reach out to the United Nations with our inadequate housing concerns? And I'm gonna ask Jodi-Ann, because Jodi, you shared a lot about the situation in Jamaica. And because there's also something that's there for me also is how this, for a lot of policymakers and for a lot of civil society, housing is perceived as a privilege rather than as a right, right? So then if the relationship of the UN is to take a long time to respond to these concerns, by the time that there's a response, people might be like, I'm still homeless, or my housing is even worse. So how do we navigate the narratives and the mechanisms?
Thanks, Genevieve, for that question. It's an important one. And I'm glad that conversation and that question was asked by somebody from Belize, because then there are also another Caribbean state that recognizes that even in a very slow international legal framework, dealing with issues from small states like ours, if there's a very long line, we're at the back of the very long line. And so it makes it very difficult for us to be incentivized to go to international mechanisms like the Inter-American Commission or the United Nations and the various bodies, because they do take a long time. In order to appeal to any of these mechanisms, you must first do something called exhaust domestic remedies. You must go to your own home country first. They must see if they can tackle the issue first. They must deal with it. You must give them the opportunity to deal with it. But unlike the Constitution of Brazil, for example, and Preta was able to explain to us the situation in Brazil, the Constitution of Jamaica doesn't speak specifically to a right to housing. It speaks to a right to property. And though the owning of title may be important, if someone rents or someone has some other housing situation, they may not feel they get the full protection of the international legal framework here in Jamaica. So the first step in any domestic situation is moving those laws from the international sphere to the domestic sphere. Persons must feel within their own countries that they can get redress. It's going to be a much faster system than appealing to international bodies and tribunals. And so part of our advocacy must surround getting states to see that having some body, whether it's a rent board, for example, that addresses eviction complaints or individuals being moved because there needs to be a highway or a development, that needs to be something that's addressed internally in the country. If we have to wait for the very, very long international tribunals to look at it, or their time for processing is extremely long. And so, as you said, Genevieve, an individual might die. And I've seen cases where individuals have died waiting for justice from these international bodies and tribunals. Where, however, an NGO or a group, or in some cases that allow for individual complaints, a body is allowed to take this case to the international bodies, there is a benefit to it. The benefit is structural change. though it won't be fast and it may not fix the individual person's complaints. And that's what we want to do when we say that a country should have internal mechanisms. There are some structural issues that can affect hundreds of thousands of people if addressed. And not only in that particular country that has that issue, but also countries with similar legal mechanisms. So if, for example, Belize were to bring a case saying that housing in the country is being given on a discriminatory basis, or as Halima pointed out in her question earlier, that there are various things that are not happening. For example, providing affordable housing to individuals with the idea that affordable is whatever you can pay, and if you can't afford to pay it, that's your business. If that is something that is brought before an international tribunal, and they assess not only the compliance with the international legal framework that the country is a part of, but also assess how the country is meeting its obligations, then it may have serious changes to the laws of the country. It will take much longer. And the naming and shaming that sometimes happens as well when a country goes before these international mechanisms may get them to operate faster, even though there has been significant advocacy in the country for years. But there is benefit to going to these tribunals because I believe in fighting on both fronts. Fight inside your country for the changes that you want to see, but understand that international bodies and tribunals have a level of visibility to them and a level of public naming and shaming to them that may be useful. Is there any real action that a state has to take as a result of them? That's a whole big discussion about international law and who does what, and if there are any police officers or any enforcement mechanisms that exist in international law. But at the core of it, I think that having as many fronts to fight on as possible helps you get where you want to go, which is allowing for women and girls, especially as they are disproportionately impacted with regard to not being able to hold title for homes, or having to depend on their partner's homes, and therefore if they leave their partner, no longer have home security. Or where issues of race intervene, where individuals are told, we don't want you around here. Or issues of color, where some people are considered to be less desirable in some neighborhoods than not. Those are issues that can be addressed both internally inside the country and through the use of those UN mechanisms. And I think that I understand the question coming from Belize. If they take so long, why use them? I say use them because having as many people shouting to your government about the same issue helps them move in the direction that we want them to move.
Thank you very, very much, Jodi-Ann, for that. It is 2:24. I want to be mindful of our participants' time and also the viewing audience time that are with us today. And you know, Dr. Gay gave Afro-Resistance some tasks, right? Some tasks to move forward. And we will definitely move with them. I think after hearing each of the speakers, one of the key things is also to expand on what the mechanisms are, because we know that states do not do a job to make sure that civil society knows that they can access these mechanisms. Furthermore, most elected officials don't even know what their state has actually signed on to. So if our elected officials, and some of them not elected officials, right, but occupying spaces, don't know that these are things that they have to guarantee, then there is a job that Afro-Resistance and other organizations need to take on, which is educating civil society on their human rights, and literally on their human rights, not just things that people earn, because you don't earn a human right, you're entitled to human rights, and to live with the respect and the dignity that accompany those human rights. So that's a task that we will be taking on, that we take on at Afro-Resistance, that we will keep on taking on and expanding on, because these rights are dependent on each other. And that's one of the core fundamental pieces of rights. If you don't have the right to housing, then how can we guarantee safety? How can we guarantee the right to education? How can we guarantee the right to live without racial discrimination? If we, the Black community, the Indigenous community, migrant community, different communities are living in continual and cyclical poverty because of violation of individual rights that impact us collectively. So there's so many aspects of this that we need to further understand. And parallel to further understanding it is really, how do we hold the governments accountable? How do we hold even the local elected officials accountable in our own communities? If there's no clean water in our own community, that is a violation. And how do we hold the government accountable to those rights? So that's a task that we are taking on, and we will continue to take on. I want to hand it over to our guests for less than a minute closing. And I also want to make sure that people support the work that Afro-Resistance is doing in supporting Black women and girls and centering Black women and girls. Because Black women and girls, you know, Anna said recently that when shifts are made and when structures are challenged and moved, it's Black women and girls that are actually doing that. So we really need to support the work that we are doing in order to make sure that that this work continues. So I'm gonna hand it first to, we're gonna go in reverse, to Jodi-Ann, then Preta, then Adwoa, and then Dr. Gay.
For me, I'm glad that Entre Fronteras decided to have this conversation, because as you said, some of these pushes happen because Black women and girls get up and say, I'm done with this, it needs to happen. I'm so proud to meet so many of you across the world who are doing this work. And the questions here that ask about affordable housing and it being treated as a right versus a privilege are such core questions that have affected us before the pandemic, but affect us now. So many children, especially girls, have been impacted by their ability to go to school because they don't have a safe space with internet access, with clean water, with resources to go to school. We said that when they could go outside to school, we were fighting for them, but a new fight has existed. A right to have not just 4 walls and a roof, but adequate housing. A home that allows you to have resources, that allows you to feel safe, that allows you to have access to amenities and services nearby. And that is the new fight that COVID has highlighted, that we have fought on many fronts, but the interdependence of rights means that if we don't fight for this right to housing, we don't get many of the other rights that we have been fighting for. Thank you for this opportunity. And I look forward to continuing this conversation as Entre Fronteras, as Afro-Resistance, and other groups and spaces exist to tease this issue out.
Adwoa?
I don't think I have much to add to what Jodi has said. She's perfectly articulated it. So I'll probably give my minute to somebody else. I will emphasize again that I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation. And I think this is an area that we haven't paid enough attention to. And I mentioned the issue of the Grenfell Tower in the UK, where it has such a massive impact. But the conversation had focused on building regulation, not on the tenants. Why this type of tenants, this group of tenants were living in these conditions? And then what happened to them after? Where are they? Where are they being housed? So in addition to having what Jodi has mentioned, accessibility, I think is also key. And just bringing into the conversation that racism is not about only access to health or access to jobs, but racism impacts on everything, on every right. For every right, there you will find this discrimination. I'll end now, but thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And over to you.
Thank you. And Preta? Yes.
Primeiro eu quero agradecer e parabenizar cada uma de vocês, dizer que eu estou muito feliz de estar reunida com todas, e eu sou porque nós somos, Se eu tenho força para lutar, para continuar, é porque vocês existem e porque vocês me fazem acreditar que lutar vale a pena e que é possível. Gratidão. Vocês são heroínas. É bom saber que eu não estou sozinha. Que a gente possa ir juntas e que possamos cada vez mais criar oportunidades para o nosso povo, porque a gente precisa disso, de criação de oportunidade, e que eu possa ser um caminho aberto para que outras garotas, que outras mulheres, assim como eu, assim que passaram também pelo que eu passei e que vão passar também, que a gente sabe que isso existe, que o racismo está aqui como um câncer em todo mundo, e que a gente está aqui para combater esse racismo, e que a gente está aqui para fazer com que nosso povo tenha todos os seus direitos garantidos, com que nosso povo seja assistido e coma do melhor, e vista do melhor, e more nos melhores lugares possíveis. Contem sempre comigo, estarei sempre à disposição. Gratidão.
Muchísimas gracias, Preta. And Dr. Gay.
Yeah, well, so much has been said that's right on target. I would just emphasize this point. A lot of people say to me, well, how can I get the UN to hold my country accountable? You know, the UN actually doesn't do that. The UN can give you the tools. You have to hold your country accountable. And you have to find the way that uses the tool in a way that makes you the most effective on the ground. I have always said in my years of working as an independent expert in the UN, the times that I have felt most effective are those times when, you know, a local NGO will come to me and say, we need you to say this. And if it is in accord with what I believe to be true, I say that, and then they take it home to say, and to say to everyone, to say to their governments, to say to their local officials, to say to their communities, that the UN says this. That's when it works. So you have to be certain of what you need from these UN mechanisms and let them know. And then take that, go home, energize your communities, take it to the press, take it to your local officials, and hold them accountable.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to the panelists. I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart our interpretation team today, Priscila Abdo, Raquel de Sousa, and Lady Vidal. Thank you so much. You really are a backbone to this operation, because without you, we would not be able to unite via language. And that's another way that in the Americas, Black people are separated. And Afro-Resistance is really intentional to bring in Black interpreters so that they can translate our way of talking, because they are part of our community and we're part of their community. So thank you so much. I want to thank Ana Barreto, who is really the curator of these conversations. Ana Barreto is our program director. And I want to thank Marie Ferreira, that is not feeling well today, and she's still joining us, and she's our communications coordinator here at Afro-Resistance. Please remember to help us keep the work going and donate, and we will see you shortly. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Excellent.
Thank you. And we'll be in communication, Dr. Gay.
Meu choro não é nada além de carnaval, é lágrima de samba na ponta dos pés. A multidão avança como vendaval, me joga na avenida que eu não sei qual é. Pirata e super-homem tentam um calor, um peixe amarelo beija minha mão, as asas de um anjo soltas pelo chão. Na chuva de confetes deixo a minha dor, na avenida deixei lá a pele preta e a minha voz. Na avenida deixei lá a minha fala, a minha A minha